next to last session of this year's conference of the Canadian Association for Work and Labour Studies. My name is Stephanie Ross. I'm the president of the association, and I'm very pleased and excited to welcome you here to hear our keynote speech from Bill Fletcher Jr. I first encountered Bill Fletcher's work in a volume edited by Kate Bronfenbrenner entitled Organizing to Win. And that article, the chapter that he wrote on union renewal and local unions with Richard Hurd, really had a very profound influence on my thinking about the dynamics of labor movement transformation. And in reading it, I knew immediately that this was a person that understood in a very grounded and material way what some of the dynamics and contradictions of the labor movement was. He was clearly fully aware of both the powerful transformative potential of the labor movement as a social movement, but also of the deep contradictions that exist within our movement. And he was not someone that would look unflinching, or would look away from those contradictions. And I very much appreciated that. It is the case that many scholars of labor studies, in our desire to support the labor movement, sometimes look at our movement with some rose-colored glasses. And what I appreciated from Bill was very much his hope and also his realism. It also, that is also reflected in his very important book, Solidarity Divided, which he wrote with Fernando Gapasin, and I think is actually required reading on my course outlines on union renewal. And it's no surprise that he has this understanding of the labor movement. He's been an activist since his teen years. He graduated from college but went to work in a shipyard, and that is how he entered into the labor movement, through direct practical experience. Over the years, he's been active in both the workplace and community struggles, in electoral campaigns. He's worked in official positions for several labor unions, as well as being a senior staff person in the national AFL-CIO. He is the former president of the TransAfrica Forum, a senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies, and a leader in many, many other important projects for economic and racial justice. His many publications, of which I've mentioned a few, are perhaps too long to list, but most recently I've been reading their Bankrupting Us, 20 other myths about unions, which is a really important, but again, not romantic response to anti-unionism, and of which I have a deep gratitude. So without further ado, please help me welcome Bill Fletcher Jr. to talk about Trump, right-wing populism, and the future of the labor movement.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I want to thank Stephanie, Brian, and Teresa for making this possible. The topic that I have, Trump, right-wing populism, and future of organized labor, could certainly keep us here until dinner. But I was told that dinner has not been ordered in, so as a result I have to make this a little briefer, which will be a challenge. But this morning when I got up, I decided I wanted to start this presentation differently than I had expected to, because I want to tell you what it felt like on November 9th. November 9th was like a massive snowstorm had hit the United States. It's really hard to describe what it was like, except there was silence. Very few people were emailing one another. There were very few phone calls. People were not out in the streets. It was earlier in the morning, when the results of the election were coming in, my wife threw a blanket over her head, reminding me of an opening scene in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy when the Earth is getting ready to end. And it was incredibly depressing. And at that moment, I chose to write something about how to look at the moment. And it got around. I was very honored by that. But it took a few days for people to shake out of this incredible despair. And then resistance started. But almost from the very beginning, I said, what we have to understand is that the Nazis just captured Paris. And that this is not simply a matter of the pendulum swinging to the right and inevitably swinging back to the left. The Nazis have captured Paris. And they drove through the Maginot Line, which in our case was the so-called blue wall that was supposed to guarantee that Hillary Clinton would win. The general staff was in complete disarray. And the Nazis won. And quickly after the Nazis won, there were collaborationists that emerged that said, let's figure out a good way to cut a deal with the new occupiers. And we have seen the rise of our own Vichy, and I will get back to that in a moment. So in order to really grasp the nature of this challenge, we have to understand first some things about the larger picture. And I like to say that there's a level of anxiety that people feel, and I used to think it was just in the United States, and I realize now it's global. There's a level of anxiety that people have been feeling for a while that is the result of the coming together of several crises. So we're not just dealing with an economic crisis, we're not just dealing with an environmental crisis, we're dealing with the convergence of an economic crisis, an environmental crisis, massive demographic changes. These coming together, so think about it as what do they call it? The land masses that come together that result in an earthquake. You have these coming together, and that is resulting in something else. And that something else is a growing lack of confidence in the legitimacy of the democratic capitalist nation state. Because the results of the combination of this economic crisis, and particularly the growth of a reconstructed global capitalism with a transnational capitalist class, has meant that the nation state's role has changed. It hasn't disappeared. The nation state's role has changed, and the nation state is less and less able to fulfill the obligations it was supposed to have according to the alleged social contract. So instead of a nation state that even goes through the pretense of some sort of redistribution of the social surplus, you have a nation state that more and more guarantees that that social surplus is controlled by the so-called 1%, which is more like the 10%. And so you have that kind of situation in country after country, and as a result, people are losing faith in the ability of the nation state to function. They look at people being elected to office and then very quickly succumbing to the pressures of neoliberal capitalism. And regardless of the rhetoric of their campaigns, what they do is that they implement a larger agenda of neoliberal capitalism, resulting in incredible despair. You have a situation where the supposed generosity of the democratic capitalist state does not exist and has been called into question as masses are told that there is simply not enough to go around. And in that environment, there is the reemergence of discussions about the deserving and the undeserving populations, which we should become very concerned about. And in the United States, it's most recently been raised again in connection with with Trump's budget, with the suggestion that there are those that deserve and there are those that are parasites, which is a theme that runs throughout the right, including but not limited to fascism. So it's here that our story turns into the matter of right-wing populism. Populism is a political movement without a firm ideology that it nevertheless counterposes the people, whoever the people are, against the elites. And it has a right-wing and left-wing variant. There are key features to right-wing populism, a term that some people take issue with, but which I'll defend, that are critical for us to understand. So one, and this is my beginning point, that right-wing populism is the herpes of capitalism. It is in the system. And when the system weakens, it emerges in very virulent forms. Right? And the weakening is particularly to be noted in the context of economic crises. Right-wing populism does not disappear from capitalism. Sometimes it is in a lesser stage, sometimes it's more limited, but it never disappears. Right-wing populism tends to be a revolt against the future. If you look at right-wing populism internationally, it doesn't have its eyes forward, it has its eyes back. It is generally looking for a mythical moment when allegedly the people, and we'll get to the people, were in a much better state. So for Al-Qaeda and Daesh, there was this legendary caliphate, which if you look through the historical record, what they described never existed on planet Earth. But that doesn't matter because the myth is important. For right-wing populism in the United States, it's the Donna Reed show in the 1950s. And it is basically the notion that the great period was the period of unbridled US superiority on the planet, when men were men, women were girls, and everyone else knew their place. And that was the 1950s. Right-wing populism also tends to be very revanchist. You can see this in extreme forms in the development of fascism, like in Germany, or the lead up to the Rwanda genocide. In the United States, the revanchism takes both a form relative to foreign policy as well as domestic policy. Revanchism in the sense of a politics of revenge, a politics of resentment. We are going to get back what was taken from us. And for right-wing populism in the United States, the revanchism is both that the United States simply can't say and do whatever it wanted to do around the world. There are other forces, and there's an immense amount of resentment about that. But the other part is that there's been a change in the United States. There have been laws, there's been the victories of progressive social movements. You can't just walk around saying nigger and spick and bitch and everything else. There are all these challenges, and there's a segment of the population that just says, no, 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 this has gone simply too far. It draws its power from identifying the people, quote unquote, in terms that are usually racist, sexist, and xenophobic. So populism as a whole talks about this notion of the people. In fact, most political movements do. But with right-wing populism, they define the people in terms that goes back to this notion of the deserving and the undeserving. So in the case of the right-wing populists in the United States, they draw their lineage going back more or less to Andrew Jackson, which is why when Trump went to visit Tennessee and went to this monument for Andrew Jackson, that was not accidental. They basically see themselves as defining the people being white people and who white people happen to be at this particular point. But it's also very sexist and obviously very xenophobic. We see the xenophobia in the attacks on certain racialized migrant groups, and we'll talk more about that later. And the sexism and the misogynism that was evident in the 2016 election was absolutely unbelievable. And the fact that it was tolerated and even advanced by women, by white women, right, shows you the depths that this has gone to, that some segment of women were in their mind, able to say that it's okay, right? That it's okay to essentially revisit the Donna Reed show. In its current moment, right-wing populism is a movement that is based among displaced and anxious natives. And by natives, I don't mean indigenous populations. I mean non-migrant majorities. And it has a strong sexist current. particularly in populations where men believe themselves to have been displaced economically and in some cases socially and politically by women. This is one of the things that's a major feature of clerical fascism in the Middle East, like in Al-Qaeda and Daesh. The notion that we have to restore the rightful role of men as the dominant forces and that women have upset the balance. Right? But you see this in most right-wing populist movements. That just happens to be one of the more extreme. So in order to appreciate the question of right-wing populism and the current crisis, we must situate it within this larger unsettling of neoliberal globalization. In the US, the growing economic divide, which received a great deal of attention, first in 2011 with Occupy and more recently in the 2016 election, focused largely on the impact of neoliberal globalization on the white worker. It's important to highlight that the 2016 debate, more than anything else, concerned the impact of trade agreements rather than on neoliberal globalization as a whole. And this is important because it speaks to the weakness taken in the approach by mainstream organized labor in its critique of neoliberal globalization, which itself focused almost exclusively on trade agreements. Trade agreements, trade agreements, and yet again, trade agreements. Thus, Donald surfaces and is able to say, the problem is NAFTA, the problem is this, and people will say, well, you know, that's what you guys in the union movement have been saying as well, so what's all the hubbub? The restructuring of global capitalism, however, preceded the rise of neoliberal globalization. In fact, by the late 1950s, early 60s, there were two features in the United States that had a dramatic impact on what would ultimately unfold in the 1970s. First, automation, and the second was suburbanization. With regard to automation, as has frequently happened, African Americans and Puerto Ricans and Chicanos were the canaries in the coal mine, a reference to a technique used by miners in the old days to determine when the air was becoming toxic. The job crisis emerged not in the 2016, not in 2008, but in the late 1950s, and was in fact a major contributing factor to the famous 1963 March on Washington, which was initiated by black trade unionists to protest the jobs crisis and racist discrimination. Interestingly, for most of organized labor, the job crisis that was affecting workers of color beginning in the late 50s and early 60s was completely ignored until it hit white workers in the 1970s. And thus, much like everything else, and as I said in the Toronto Labor Council last night, it's very reminiscent of what's happening with this opioid crisis in the United States, where heroin has existed in black communities, Latino communities, and it was never a problem because, of course, this was a cultural issue. Black people don't have the right families, we don't pray to God enough, we don't do this, we don't do that, we're not really taking care of ourselves. And then when a white young woman in Ohio dies from an opioid overdose, then it is declared there's a national crisis. Suburbanization was a contributing factor to the metropolitan segregation that we witnessed over the last 60 years. White professional managerial strata, as well as higher paid white workers, moved out of the cities. This was assisted by the GI Bill, which was racially constructed. And active segregationist policies were adopted by banks with the assistance of the US government. This process helped to change the consciousness among white workers specifically, and many other whites generally, to enhance their belief in the so-called American dream, and thus recalling those great years in the 1950s. Thus, the so-called golden age of US capitalism was one where the roots of the current crisis can actually be seen. Toward the end of the 1960s, interestingly, the suburbanization began to reverse itself as the fire, insurance, and real estate segments of capital became the hegemonic sectors over the larger metropolitan areas. In part inspired by the fuel crisis, FIRE, which is the acronym, advanced the process that came to be understood as gentrification. Ironically, cities began to see racial and class cleansing unfold, pushing immigrants, lower sector workers, and people of color into marginal or dead cities. If I had more time, I'd go into more depth about that. For whites as a whole, there was no crisis until the 1970s. By the mid-70s, this is precisely what happened. When it did, a far-right movement began to gain traction, guided by theorists of the then-referenced New Right, such as Richard Viguerie and Paul Weyrich. This right-wing movement was multi-tendencied and included secular and religious conservatives as well as right-wing populists. They're not the same. And one of the mistakes that the left frequently makes is to put all the right together in one pot, label it fascist, and think that that explains something. Sometimes these forces in the right collaborated. In other cases, they were in competition. But they became very visible with the rise of several reactionary mass movements, which they helped to start, including the anti-tax movement, anti-abortion, gun rights, anti-busing, anti-Panama Canal, and increasingly anti-racialized immigration. And just as a sub-note, when I talk about racialized immigration, what I mean is that in the last 50 years, there is no mass movement against migration from Russia, from the Ukraine, from Ireland, Italy, right? When people talk about immigrants, they're not talking about European immigrants. And in fact, when Trump talked about the immigrants bringing crime to the United States and talked about the Mexicans bringing crime, not once during his campaign, as far as I can tell, did he ever mention the most feared criminal organization in the United States, which did not come from Mexico, did not come from China, did not come from El Salvador. It was the Russian mafia. And not once did he suggest deporting Russians or shooting down planes coming from Russia with migrants. Without going into depth, it's worth noting that the leadership of these right-wing movements set a very low bar for entry and participation into these different movements. They also proposed in the infamous Lewis Powell memo a multi-pronged assault on the welfare state and Keynesian economics, an assault that included propaganda, mass movements, litigation, and electoral legislative efforts. It is within this larger right-wing movement that one could see the strengthening of right-wing populism. This has been a movement that bases itself largely among whites who feel that they are losing out to the so-called American dream. And it's worth noting here that contrary to what was said immediately after the election about all these white workers mobilizing around Trump, it turns out that that wasn't really the case, that the people that were mobilizing against, in support of Trump, tended to be people who had not lost out, who had not lost their jobs, but actually feared that they would. Right? And it's very significant when you look at that because it has immense strategic implications. The other contributing factor in order to understand this moment has been the implications of domestic neoliberalism. As neoliberal economics spread from the Republican Party into the Democratic Party, and ultimately becoming the dominant framework for most of the Democratic Party, it had a significant impact on the base of the Democrats. The Democratic Party went through a monumental change in which it expanded demographically, especially bringing in more women and people of color, while at the same time embracing neoliberal economics and distancing itself from many of the basic demands of the trade union movement. This has been incorrectly described as a rise of identity politics. It was more a reflection of contradictory tendencies rooted in different struggles, including the struggle to democratize the Democratic Party. We can perhaps discuss this later if we have time, but we should hasten to add that the Democratic Party ultimately embraced civil rights and the expansion of the social safety net to include people of color. But this embrace was considered a betrayal by many whites who saw this as providing services and benefits to illegitimate and undeserving populations. Further, neoliberalism introduced a growing authoritarianism at the level of the democratic capitalist state that the late Nicholas Pouansas noted in his final book, State Power Socialism, where he discussed the rise of what he referenced as authoritarian statism. I have used the term neoliberal authoritarian state, but I believe that I'm essentially saying the same thing that Pouansas did, although obviously he did it much more eloquently. The parameters of democracy have been closing in on us since the 1970s. The acceptable discourse has been increasingly limited, while the so-called national security state has been strengthened. This is not fascism. I repeat, this is not fascism. There are various forms of right-wing authoritarianism, including fascism, coup regimes, and conservative dictatorships. Neoliberal authoritarianism seems to be a preemptive assault on popular classes in anticipation of resistance to the continued impact of global capitalist restructuring along with a global environmental crisis. At the risk of speculation, this authoritarianism may extend beyond neoliberalism, particularly if neoliberalism collapses. The transnational capitalist class faces a challenge in terms of methods of accumulation if neoliberalism is abandoned. But in either case, the pressures of the environment, along with overaccumulation crisis within capitalism, may continue this tendency towards authoritarian solutions. The fact that neoliberalism and forms of the neoliberal authoritarian state have been introduced by both politically conservative and politically liberal administrations should not lead one to the conclusion that this is all a grand conspiracy, nor that all of these politicians are the same. If anything, the process appears to be driven by the strengthening of the transnational capitalist class, though in each case, the specific features of the unfolding of neoliberalism and the neoliberal authoritarian state are unique to that nation state. And they play themselves out in ways that I don't have time to go into detail at this moment. Right-wing populism, quite ironically, has emerged as an inconsistent and disingenuous opponent of neoliberal globalization. Authoritarian at its core, right-wing populism nevertheless builds itself on populations that are feeling displaced by neoliberal globalization. Though they may rhetorically challenge both neoliberalism and globalization, they do not actually challenge neoliberalism, as evidenced in Poland and Hungary, for example. One does not see a war against foreigners, one does not see a battle against neoliberalism by the right-wing populists. One does see, however, a war against foreigners, organized workers, and women. Neoliberalism has destroyed the dream of white Americans. They have reacted with a vengeance, but they have reacted this way for a combination of reasons, including matters of race, but also in the current moment, the impact of the Obama administration, or I should say the contradictory impact of the Obama administration. So let us be clear that regardless of any criticisms that one has of the Obama administration, and I have many, the central feature of the Republican assault on his administration revolved around race and the racialization by the right of what is left of the welfare state. His victory in 2008, and to a lesser extent in 2012, seemed to be, for many people, progressive and liberals, the harbinger of a new era. Too many liberal and progressive people saw in Obama what they wanted to see. Obama, however, was a neoliberal in taking office and remained committed to that vision, albeit with elements of a more progressive stand on certain basic social issues and in favor of a social safety net. But he was not committed to the older Roosevelt-era welfare state or to Keynesian economics. He was committed to stabilizing capitalism, which his administration actually did quite well at. Most progressive social movements misread the Obama administration and made a series of mistakes, some strategic and others tactical. The most basic mistake was strategic and was represented in a manner that I've often demonstrated through an allegory referencing the battle of the Crater in 1864. And let me just say briefly, this was in the US Civil War, and the city of Petersburg was surrounded by Union forces, and the Confederate defenses were very substantial. And the Union forces came up with this brilliant idea to dig a tunnel underneath the Confederate forces, load it up with explosives, and set it off. And so they did, and it was very successful. It blasted this immense crater in the middle of the Confederate defenses. And the idea was that Union troops were supposed to enter the crater and then keep going after the Confederates. So the explosion goes off, the Confederates panic and start running. The Union forces enter the crater and they stop. And they look around and they marvel at the destruction that they had wrought. And they sit in the crater. And they just keep marveling at it, looking at body parts and everything, right? And at a certain point, the Confederates realized the Union troops weren't chasing them anymore. And they regrouped, came back, and massacred the Union soldiers. We had our Battle of the Crater in 2009. the victory of Obama was something that completely shattered the defenses of the Republicans. And the Republicans went scurrying. They could not seem to reorganize. But the forces that had brought Obama into office sat in a crater. And the Confederates reorganized and came back. The Obama administration promoted the demobilization of the progressive base, and in doing so, laid the foundation for the rise of a right-wing populist movement, including but not limited to the Tea Party and later the Trump presidential campaign. The Obama administration did just enough to infuriate and mobilize the right wing, but not enough to inspire progressive social movements. At every turn, he seemed to be prepared to compromise with the forces of darkness, as if to do so was to prove that he was a mature political actor. The Tea Party and the birther movement filled the void. Organized labor did little but complain, and the Black freedom movement was badly divided over how to respond, in part because masses of African Americans saw in Obama hope and saw it as attackers, the forces of Satan. Which brings us to Trump. That was pretty smooth, wasn't it? Did I expect him to win? No. But I thought that it was absolutely possible because I didn't trust most white voters. And I said this to whoever would listen. I said, don't pay attention to the polls. This is a volatile situation. I don't think that Trump ever thought he was going to win. And when I look at what happened immediately after the election, I think that was pretty confirming. But he tapped into a sentiment among many white Americans that has not been openly expressed by mainstream politicians. Pre-Trump, there was this thing that people call dog whistle politics that uses race, but uses race in codes. With Trump, we have bugle politics. No dog whistle at all. It is absolutely blatant. And one of the things that was critically important for his base, and one of the things that we have to understand as why his base will stick with him, even when he turns on it, is that they look at Trump as offering the necessary correction to what they believe to have been the greatest mistake in U.S. history, the election of a black president. The anger was deep, and it was captured by the sense of revanchism, which I mentioned earlier. It was also operating with the context of what I've called a united right front, whose principal objective has been and remains the overturning of the 20th century. Despite Trump's protests to the contrary, his movement fit well within the sense that the clock had to be turned back. Yes, unevenly, yes, allegedly protect Medicare, but turn the clock back all the same. So why did he win? And I am probably running out of time. So he won, as I mentioned last night in the council, he did not win. He won the electoral vote as a result of a legacy of slavery, the Electoral College. Second, the Republican base returned home. It did not remain fragmented, and that's in part because of the one brilliant thing he did, which was pick Pence as his running mate, and thereby aligning with the evangelicals. Voter suppression, which has gotten very little attention, but the elimination of millions of voters through the purging of voter rolls was critical in this. A small but significant reversal of votes in certain key states. Not the millions and millions of white folks rising, but in certain key states. Race, which has been now documented as being the principal factor mobilizing the Trump voter, and that included the racialization of migration. And finally, the demobilization of the former Obama base, that a lot of people just stayed home, or they didn't vote the top of the ticket. And this happened in Michigan and Wisconsin with devastating consequences. So a couple of points. One was that there's no mandate that comes out of this election. And two, you notice I didn't mention the Russians. Now this doesn't mean that I don't think the Russians had some sort of role. I actually think that they did, in much the same way that the US regularly has a role in undermining other people's elections. Just to make that point. But there's also this issue of black propaganda, which I think in this age of social media is very, very dangerous. that people believe what is on the internet, and particularly if it reinforces their own prejudices. And there are various nefarious forces that have made use of that. So what has this all meant for organized labor? Well, the movement has been in a process of decline at least since the 1950s, I would say perhaps at least since 1948. But it's really been in a major crisis since the 1980s. And there have been a number of efforts at reform, but one of the problems with organized labor is that it doesn't really understand the critical moment that it missed. The critical moment that could have turned things in a dramatically different way. And that is the rise of the civil rights phase of the Black freedom movement, and what it would have meant had there been actually real unity between the trade union movement and the Black freedom movement. We could have been talking about a transformative moment. The reform movements that developed in organized labor, particularly in the 90s, ran out of steam. The administration of the current leadership of the AFL-CIO under Richard Trumka, while Trumka is quite outstanding in many respects, he did not succeed in building a governing, transformative coalition. There have also been immense splits within organized labor, particularly around trade and the environment. And you saw last year the whole fight around the Dakota pipeline and others, segments of organized labor, basically articulating that we can have jobs even if we can't breathe. And so you have that element of organized labor that is coming after the environmental movement, attacking the environmental movement, and attacking forces within organized labor that understand the importance of the environmental movement. There is what may be a left-leaning leadership in some unions emerging, particularly the American Postal Workers Union, the Communication Workers of America, the American Amalgamated Transit Union, National Nurses United, perhaps the Steel Workers, that a number of these unions backed the candidacy of Bernie Sanders, and they seem to be trying to regroup. And then I mentioned before there's the emergence of the Vichyites. And these are, I would argue, the unions that met with Trump after the inauguration, that were prepared to sit down with him, in one case to praise his inaugural address, in another case to say that this was a new era for the American working class, which it is, but they meant something differently than I do. But I look at them as Vichyites. These are collaborators. These are people that basically believe that they can cut the best deal with the oppressor that will at least save them from the showers for now. So this begs this question of the role of organized labor in resistance. And I want to end here because I want to make sure we have a few minutes for some exchange. I said a few weeks ago, and this was a very difficult thing for me to say, that for the first time in my life, I have to confess that I do not know whether organized labor can, as a whole, muster the strength to be a central force in the fight back. I never had illusions about organized labor. When I got involved, I was already a radical, but I wasn't a radical with looking at organized labor as a panacea. I looked at it and understood its warts and problems, but basically thought that it could be turned around. I'm not sure anymore. It is paralyzed and divided, largely focused on self-protection. And it is, to borrow from the words of the General Secretary of the South African Federation of Trade Unions, Zwelinzima Vavi, it's engaged to a great extent in the politics of the status quo. And in order for it to be a central player in the resistance movement, it will have to engage in a dramatic internal transformation. If there is a future for organized labor, it can be found in the work of institutions like the Washington State Labor Council that I've had the honor of doing work with, that has engaged in internal education and united front building. It's been a central player in the building of something called the Washington Alliance of Resistance and Power, and has also been engaged in developing a curriculum for worker education that focuses on racial justice, and something that is not a 30-minute speech and is not a diversity training. That organized labor is desperately, that there's a desperate need right now for the reemergence of a radical and anti-sectarian left that understands that it must be about building that broader front, not just waving the flag of resistance, not waving the flag of its own purism, but building the front and understanding what the right has always understood, which is that the bar to entry into our movement must be low. That it must be easy for people that embrace the basic notion of resistance to enter into our movement. And we must have a progressive electoral challenge, state by state. There is too much of a tendency among progressives and liberals to wait every 4 years for the presidential elections to throw in and to forget about everything else. We've got to be involved in the fight for power. History demonstrates that timing is everything. History is very unforgiving, and it shows that once an opportunity is lost, it may be lost for decades, if not more. Organized labor is in a race against time against right-wing populism. The inability of organized labor to respond to the reconfiguration of capitalism and its skittishness in addressing race and gender has placed it in a decidedly weakened position in addressing this moment. But so too were those in France, who in the summer of 1940 could only look with despair at a country that had collapsed in weeks under the treads of the German blitzkrieg and the gutlessness of its own general staff. It took time, but the battle cry of resistance was heard and a spirit emerged, a spirit of resistance, a spirit represented by the outgunned but never despairing Maquis. The Maquis that had to employ strategies, tactics, and organization in a manner that only a few months earlier could never have been conceived. An asymmetric situation, to borrow a term from our current era. This, my friends, is the hour of the Maquis. Thank you very much.